Ladies and gentlemen, do welcome to the next episode of my Safe Bet Show, and it gives me a great pleasure and it's our utmost privilege, of course, to welcome Keith Whyte, a man that requires no introduction to the show. So welcome, Keith. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Martin. I really appreciate it. It's good. It's good to see you again, my friend.
Absolutely. For, I suppose, the three of you and the vast crowd that might have never heard Keith, Keith is the fearless leader, chief executive of the National Council on Problem Gambling, and we'll come out to deciphering that moniker.
Yeah.
But prior to that, Keith also spent some time with the American Gaming Association as well as the American Bar Association. So Keith's been in this association space and has been dealing with a lot of associations related business for a number of years, which I may actually, it's a very nice segue into my first question, because you have served as executive director of the NCPG since 1998. Very, very impressive. And you've done so very successfully. So can you even remember what life, I mean, mainly, of course, your professional life was before that Anno Domini moment for the US, if not the global gambling industry?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It is a great question, and I think about that a lot. We try not to live in the past, but of course, you do have that reference. So when I got into the gambling field in 1995, gambling in America was a lot different than it is today, and I think crime was a big issue, organized crime in particular. The economics of restaurants were these were driving factors in the public policy debate around gambling. And problem gambling or gambling addiction was relatively underaddressed. And I think the only insight I had back in 95 was that problem gambling was going to become a bigger issue. And so even at the AGA, as I started to work with groups like the National Council, we saw that gambling was going to expand across America. And, it seemed to me that that was the big public policy issue. How do we address the small but important percentage of the population may have a problem? So it wasn't seen as a national public issue in 1995. I don't think it's quite there yet today but we're making a lot of progress. But I think there's a lot more awareness among the industry because responsible gambling was not really a term of art in the casino side, at least back in 1995 either. So it's interesting to look back where we were. We've made a tremendous amount of progress in partnership, and we've got a lot of new companies coming into the space, such as Entain, that are bringing some valuable lessons too. So responsible gambling, problem gambling, it's never static. I think that's the only other takeaway from this almost 30 years of experience in gambling is that the issue constantly evolves. There's constantly new things. We're learning and we're evolving and changing, and which makes it exciting and rewarding as a field that I've spent most of my professional career.
First of all, thank you for your very kind words about Entain. I'm, of course, not being biased at all. And you've already started talking about your motivation to take on this, indeed, rather challenging, but hopefully at the same time gratifying role. And I noticed in your resume that one of your degrees is Bachelor of Arts in History.
Yeah.
You mentioned to me prior to us pushing the recording button that you were in the throes of reading Van Gogh's letters, hopefully in Dutch or French, your choice, of course. So what indeed motivated you back then to take that leap of faith from being focused on the history of arts, and also having been a researcher and a lead researcher for the likes of the American Gaming Association, to take on this role, which I suppose in essence is rather different from what you had done previously?
It is, but I think the strong through line of my career has been advocacy for those who have no voice. So at American Bar Association, I worked on international human rights, civil rights, and gay and lesbian issues. Prior to that, at Health and Human Services, I was working on healthcare reform at the national level. So that's when I went to the American Gaming Association, gambling was again a rare issue, and problem gambling was certainly seen as something that was important, but relatively minor. And so it was going to the National Council was sort of was a nice return to that advocacy, because I think people with gambling problems are one of the most stigmatized groups in all of America. We know from public opinion surveys that people are much more comfortable with someone who's a drug addict, someone who has a disability, all these other things. Just problem gamblers have so much shame, and there's so much misunderstanding. So it's been that's probably been a big part of my career. But yes, I mean, I love the history of gambling. I love the art and literature around gambling. My minor was international relations. I've been lucky enough to travel to more than 30 countries in this position, get to know people from around the world, talk about the cross cultural issues with gambling, and so it's been rewarding and fulfilling for so many of my interests and passions. Gambling in some ways, I can assign gambling to anything. You could be talking about art, you can be talking about literature, you can be talking about economics, technology. There's always a connection back to gambling.
And you very much become, if I may put it that way, part of the history of this industry and a fixture. We will come on to talking about the stigma that is still indeed associated with gambling, but for now, sticking to the theme of history and genesis and evolution. You've been in this role since 1998. So how has your own organization evolved to take on all the latest challenges and make sure that you guys do keep yourselves up to speed with all that has been happening in this sector, not only in the United States, but of course all around the world?
An organization as old as ours is, really does have that challenge of not staying stuck in the past, because the National Council was founded in 1972. So it is our 50th anniversary this year. And to maintain our advocacy over 5 decades has really been, I think, a really great achievement. But it's been a challenge because the world is much different than it was in 1972, much less in 1998. And so one of the things that keeps us vibrant is our connection to what we call in the United States the recovery community. Worldwide, it's probably more the lived experience community. But ever since we were founded by Gamblers in Recovery in 1972, we've maintained that connection to the recovery community. So there's always been, for the last 50 years, a member of our board of directors who has their roots in the recovery community. We've always had not just state chapters, but we also have individual members who are recovering gamblers and researchers and counselors, people that are working every day connected to those who are suffering. And so that's our root. That's our compass. We've stayed true to our mission, which is to be the advocate for services for problem gamblers and their families. And also the thing that goes along with that, that's part and parcel of our role as an advocate, is to be neutral on legalized gambling. Often misunderstood, but it's been a critical part of our success because we do not shame and stigmatize and judge either people who have gambling problems or people who provide gambling services or state governments that tax and regulate. We're the broad stakeholder group that works with everybody without shame and the stigma that everyone else may face. So I think between our advocacy roots and our role of neutrality, that's what's kept the National Council vibrant these last 50 years.
Well, congratulations on the anniversary, 50 years, 50, to spell it out, no mean feat, an amazing achievement, and as a serving member of your advisory board, and thanks for giving me that role. I've had the privilege and pleasure to have worked with many of the advocates you have just alluded to. Talking about NCPG, I reckon many people stick to that because they don't want to get the full moniker wrong. So I've already spelled it out. I'll do it again so that once and for all, everybody's clear on that. National Council on Problem Gambling. You've started talking to the etymology of that moniker.
Yeah.
But would you mind explaining, putting a bit more flesh on those on those bones, rather? Why is it problem, not responsible or sustainable gambling? And also, why is it gambling and not gaming? Because historically, still probably till the present day, there's been a lot of confusion between those two words, and it doesn't really help that the Americans and the Brits use those terms for slightly different things. So if you could talk to that a little,
Yeah.
that would be great.
Well, yeah, and this is also, I think, to get to the end, this is something that continues to evolve. Because we were founded, you know, again in 1972. Gambling was the common term, especially for when you talk about people with problems. So it, these days, problem gaming is a separate thing. It probably, in most people's mind, relates to video gaming, and it's most often associated with adolescence. So the term of gaming has I think probably plateaued in the United States gambling industry, and it is increasingly, I think, gaming is being used on the more the video gaming side, an excessive video gaming side. So I think there was probably a point in time where we would have considered moving to gaming. Now I think we're deliberately we're glad we didn't, because that's becoming a separate issue. Problem gambling has always been the broadest term, well understood by the lay public. Things like compulsive, pathological, again, are very stigmatizing. Addiction, is also stigmatizing. Gambling disorder is the latest term from the American Psychiatric Association, but I don't think it's not well understood by the public. So you do have this. The nomenclature is difficult. It's important. Um, and we're now, but we constantly look. We At one time, there's a serious proposal to be the National Council on Problem and Pathological Gambling, which I think would have been a step in the wrong direction. But but names are important, and I think it's a great question, because as we talk about, we're still pushing the field forward. Our name may not always fit, and I think as we go through the strategic planning process, as we work with our board members, it's a conversation we need to continue to have to make sure that it reflects our advocacy and our neutrality, and that it properly encapsulates our concerns without further stigmatizing those we serve. So I can tell you that yes, it's been a good name for us for 5 decades, but maybe not for 6 decades. It needs to continue to evolve as well, and we need feedback from all these stakeholders. And so it's a wonderful discussion and conversation to have. And again, your viewpoint and the others of these viewers, that's all part of that learning that we need to do to make sure that it still reflects who we are.
Well, to give you my personal view of the bat, and right here, right now, I do agree that adding the word pathological to the name would have further baffled people, because clearly the NCPG is the biggest, if I may call it that way, in the non-marketing sense, is the biggest responsible gambling brand out there, and you will most definitely continue your valuable service to the community. You've already mentioned that and explained the reasons why you have taken a neutral stance on the likes of sports betting regulation in the United States, i.e. it does not mean that you would not be involved and that you would not be helping those out there who have tried their hand with sports betting, and unfortunately it's created problems for them. That's not what it means. So perhaps if you could explain, where do you currently stand on what I keep calling the still rampant bonanza of sports betting regulation in the US, specifically from the viewpoint of problem as well as responsible gambling?
Yeah. And I think that exactly is where we want to be. We want to help everyone better balance the costs and benefits. We want to minimize harm so that everyone can maximize the benefits. Individual gamblers who gamble recreationally and enjoy it, we want them to maximize that benefit. We want states to maximize the benefit of the tax revenues, operators to maximize the benefit. But you can't maximize benefits without also balancing the costs. So trying to help find that harmony is our journey. And our neutrality is often misunderstood, especially by critics who are anti-gambling. They believe that somehow that we've been bought off by the gambling industry or by state government or by some mysterious force. Our neutrality is like the Swiss neutrality. It's an aggressive, it's an armed neutrality. So many people have felt the criticism of the National Council. We are free, and we continue to not just work with all stakeholders, but continue to push stakeholders and even criticize stakeholders. So neutrality is never is we could start sitting back. We're not passive observers. We're very active participants in this debate and discussion. And, but we believe that the best way forward is to work with all the stakeholders, including you, including state governments, including individuals in recovery, and find that better harmony. So when it comes to the expansion of sports betting, that is a decision for states and for individuals. Whether a state should choose to legalize sports betting, whether an individual participates, are decisions that are left to them. The National Council will advise, will assist, will work with every single stakeholder, will work with individuals, will work with counselors, with states, with operators, with regulators, to try and better balance the costs and benefits. That's the unique role we play. We don't play all roles. There's a lot of things that we can't and don't do, but the role we do play, and I think play very well, is to be that advocate for problem gamblers and their families from that neutral stance, which makes us, I think, a lot more credible and objective than someone who at their heart is either trying to abolish legalized gambling or conversely, an operator, let's say, not an insane, but someone who has only profit and no social responsibility whatsoever.
And I would suggest you'd be a great Swiss. You might need to change your family name to Weiss or Blanc or Bianco. Unfortunately, I don't know what the equivalent is in Retro-Romanche, but you would be a fantastic Swiss as a result of your experience of non-aggressive neutrality. As I'm sure the listeners of that podcast, hopefully an ever-increasing number, would have noticed, there's a continuous debate in the United States about the likes of, and we will come on to talking about helplines, but the likes of self-exclusion, which from my perspective is pretty much a fixture and a given. So I will ask a slightly different question. Do you believe now, when at least those US markets that have regulated early are now maturing and settling down, is there now a good time to ramp up efforts in connection with potentially introducing more granular, more in-depth responsible gambling tools that would go beyond what's already out there?
That's the question of the moment. You're right. And that's the question we're living right now. I think we're seeing the limits, quite frankly, of voluntary self-regulation. Because in the United States context, with our hundreds of different jurisdictions, the lowest bar for regulation is extremely low, and so the way we're doing voluntary compliance in the United States, it often defaults down to the lowest common denominator. And unfortunately, like I said, in many states, that's there's no employee training required, there's no self-exclusion required. There's no public funding for problem gambling programs. And so it makes it hard. It makes it hard to rely completely on that. So we are pushing regulators to try and harmonize and elevate their standards. But we also celebrate the folks at the top who are, as you say, going far beyond what's required. And so it's a push-pull. We want to celebrate people that are doing really good stuff and encourage not just companies to adopt it because it's good politics, it's good PR, but also because it's good for your bottom line. And so trying to make that case and getting help from partners like you to make that case why it's important for Entain as a global business to be socially responsible might help persuade some of those peers who are doing little until they're required. So we're also big believers in technology. I think there's some incredible tech that's coming down the pike. Technology will never be the silver bullet, but there are some really exciting things that are going to teach us not just about abnormal gambling behavior, the 2%. They're going to teach us about the 98% of people who gamble recreationally without harm, and trying to promote and elevate the protective factors for the 98% is just as, if not even more important, than looking at the risk factors and how we mitigate and modify those for the 2%. So we're spending equal time working on both, and we're working again with the companies that work with us, and we're prodding those who are choosing not to engage. Unfortunately, there are still major casino companies in the United States that don't train their employees on responsible gambling. That is just such a bedrock, lowest of lowest bars. So if you tell me you've got 20,000 employees and you only train the ones in the states where you're required, And so, the other 10,000 employees that work in states where training's not required, you don't, even though it's good in the states where you regulate it. That's a company that is not going to do their own corporate social responsibility quite well. So it's a mixed bag. I think, to the point of your question, but that's the big struggle, to work with those folks that are doing well. At the same time, we're pushing, they're often people that are their peers and competitors to do more.
It is a shame indeed. So I take it you believe that the bottom line itself is still the key incentive towards taking these proactive steps with a view to achieving long-term sustainability of these markets. Because I presume certainly I do, we still want to be in our jobs 5-10 years from now, and hopefully the industry will be offering not only the most exciting, most attractive products, but also the safest and most, to use the word again, sustainable products. On to the big one for you, I presume, if I may, helplines. You would have heard it, all the time, a big outcry, and by now we know about your laudable effort to negotiate with your New Jersey chapter that happened to have had the foresight to launch, I would strongly suggest, the most recognizable US-wide 1-800 number, i.e. 1-800-GAMBLER. So what is your take on all this? Lots of states, most states around this country have a helpline of their own, although still rerouted and connected. But or is this just a pipe dream, but would one nationwide helpline genuinely focused on helping people? Is that the way forward, the swift, smooth and soothing way to ensuring that we help people that might be running or have already run into issues and problems with their gambling?
Yeah, because I think that's exactly the point. How can we make it easier for people who may need help to get the help they need? And I think it's unquestionable that having one number that works everywhere across the United States is by far the best way. And it's not just because it's what we say in the gambling field. It's what we do for every other disease and disorder and crisis. That's why we have 911. That's why we have national suicide lines, But so I think the really important distinction here is that one national number does not mean one national call center. So our structure is much like 911, a highly distributed structure. So you call one number, but then you're immediately and instantly routed to dozens of different state level call centers. So those are the state level helplines that still play a massive and important role in this discussion. So it's one national umbrella, but then it gets people right back into that network of existing helplines. So it's not going to decrease. In fact, it will, moving to the national number, especially with national sports betting advertising, will increase the number of calls and increase the number of correct calls, because instead of trying to hunt for 27 different numbers in one point font shown for 1 second on the screen, you've got one number that works everywhere, but gets you to that existing state help, that same state helpline number. So that's all we're trying to do. It's not a national helpline. It's a national helpline number that connects to and depends on that network of state resources. So the National Council, we don't answer any of those numbers. But beyond that, the biggest thing beyond the national number, that's taking a little bit of time and energy. We're spending a lot more time, and again, this is funded by groups like yours as well as by the NFL, is to modernize that entire system. These helplines, as you remember, were set up in the early 90s when we had no cell phones, when there was no sports betting period. There was no sports betting advertising. Most gamblers didn't cross state borders. And so it is an analog system now in a digital age. And so we're catching up, and we're doing things like certifying and accrediting call centers and workers. We're doing some great things with data harmonization so that we'll be able to get a national picture of calls. We're doing things with the technology to try and get geolocation, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of details, but the helpline modernization effort, one number is part of that, but it's frankly relatively a small part. The bulk of our time and energy is going to improving all that analog infrastructure and bringing it into the digital age to make sure we are where people need to be, so that we're making it as easy as possible. We're knocking down as many barriers as we can for gamblers to get help, not just by calling anymore, but by text, by chat. And that's where we're seeing, frankly, Martin, the biggest increases in calls It's not on our phone, even though that's going 50, 100%. It's text and chat because that's where, of course, most people are today. So we're taking steps, we're getting there, but it's been an underfunded system for a long time. This is a system that until very, very recently has not had the injection of resources that it would need to be on par with other national crisis lines. But we're getting there.
And fingers crossed that you will. We
Yeah.
shall wish you all the best with this very laudable effort. And also, I would suggest that from the practical perspective, if we manage to sort it out, and some of those monikers out there like 1-800 admit it, 1-800 hope, and boy, if all that is unified, then even in gambling and sports betting related adverts, there will be much more space as opposed to font-free messages with all those numbers for proper responsible gambling messaging. Moving on to, if I may, to the wider and the bigger picture. I reckon we'll be once again singing from the same hymn sheet if I say that continuous research and education play an absolutely critical role in raising awareness about both problem and responsible gambling. So could you tell us a little bit about any projects close to your heart that you and the NCPG, all the folks out there, and once again, kudos to them for everything that you guys have been doing. Projects that you have run, supported with, and I may be biased again, we've run the likes of Operation RG for the military and veteran community together. So what is out there, and to the extent you're allowed to share with us, what is coming further down the track?
Yeah, we've got some exciting stuff that we've worked on together. So as you said, Operation RG, Operation Responsible Gambling, is a website dedicated to military and veterans to help them get help for their gambling problem. It uses videos, first-person videos from veterans who've had gambling problems themselves to help other veterans understand it's okay to talk about this, to reduce the shame and stigma, and of course, to direct them to resources. And Operation Responsible Gambling.org is due for a big overhaul. There's a lot more content we're putting up there, and we're working with our military committee, which is chaired by Rich Taylor from BetMGM, who we both know very well. So Operation RG, there's some exciting stuff there, and there's some implications even at the federal level that we hope to announce very, very soon. Also, one of the biggest research projects in the history of gambling in America was launched in 2018 when we went to the Entain Foundation US and we said, Martin, we actually went to you prior to the Supreme Court ruling. We said, look, we know sports betting is going to expand. Can you help us do a baseline study so that we will forever be able to measure change against this 2018 survey? Ideally, that was going to go out before most states expanded gambling. You were very generous enough to say yes. And so that first Engage survey that was done in 2018 surveyed 28,000 Americans on their sports betting attitudes and experiences. With that baseline, we've been able to measure change now. We've done the second wave of the survey in 2021. We'll do the third wave in 2023. But again, the 2 points that are critical on this Engage survey. One, it was a great partnership with the industry. And two, it created a baseline. And three, it's astounding to us that no one else was looking at that. Not the federal government, not the state governments, not private foundations. No one else looked at that Supreme Court decision and thought, gee, I think there's going to be a huge expansion of gambling. Wouldn't it be nice to get a national baseline? Because once gambling's expanded, you can survey now, but without a baseline, you're not measuring change. So those are two of the projects that are underway. We've got some really exciting stuff coming on responsible gambling research. We've got some really exciting stuff on responsible gambling words and themes that is going to be of great help for anybody in the industry who is training their employees on trigger words or what they might hear from customers that may or may not be a sign of a gambling problem. So there's some really awesome stuff. Youth, we're going to do a survey on youth gambling, and then last but not least, we've got some really exciting stuff coming down the pike on payments and our internet responsible gambling standards.
The audience might know that you're a huge soccer fan. Soccer
the
as
real
in football.
World football.
Football as in soccer. And I suppose besides David Beckham, Victoria Beckham, not so much. You're probably the most well-versed person in America in all things soccer/football. So if I may put you on the spot right here, right now, and ask a couple of questions, what are your predictions for the November World Cup?
Oh, that's a great one. So I think for the U.S. national team, I think if we can get out of the group stage, we've got a little bit of a tricky group with England and either Wales, Scotland, or Ukraine. And if Ukraine does qualify, they're going to be such a sentimental favorite for the group, and so that really alters things because emotion plays such a huge role in football. And so I think the group is winnable. But then once you start to get to the knockout rounds, I have to go with I don't know. It's a great one. I mean, I think Belgium is starting maybe their golden generation's a little bit uh, old in the tooth now. So I think it's anybody's game. I think the Germans might surprise some folks. I don't unfortunately think the English are going to go too far. I don't think it's their time again. They're still chasing. So I do think it's probably a continental power. I don't know that Brazil is all that great this year. So it's yeah, but I think it's anybody's game. I think this is one of the most fascinating World Cups because it's a bigger field, because there's so many new entrants, and because the emotion, the dynamics around some of these groups. I think there's a lot of groups of death. I think there's some really good stuff coming out of Africa that we may see, and then again, you can't discount the power of playing on home turf for some of these African sides. So I think it's anybody's game, but it's a fascinating one, and it's also a great global conversation. We can have, in the gambling community, there's a lot of us that work internationally that all talk every 4 years. We have our favorites and we have predictions and we follow the markets, obviously. So anyway, it's a great question, and that's why we watch though, because much like gambling, the outcome is never predicted, and even favorites can stumble. So it makes it a good tournament.
So from the sound of it, you fancy the New England and other folks against the good old England, which will prevent Harry Kane and the boys from singing "It's Coming Home." It may not come home again. And I will try to ignore, because Brazil being married to a Brazilian and with the Czechs not having qualified, shame on them. It's a bit of a low blow. I'll try to ignore it, but Brazil will be my team. So me, my wife, and our little one will be cheering for them. Finally, and I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't ask you about your Atlanta Falcons.
Yes.
A team that did great, 28-3 up 6-7 years ago, and it sadly didn't work out. But can the Falcons fly high again? And do you think that they had a good draft? What caught my eye, for obvious reasons, was the fact that your first round pick happens to be called Drake London. So what's your take on that?
Trading away Matt Ryan was a bold decision. I think it's a shame. I think he probably still has some good years in him, but at some point you do have to move on and identify the next quarterback of the future. I think their draft was good. They just need help all across the board, though. And these days in the NFL, you either have a franchise quarterback like, I don't know, Tom Brady, someone's personal favorite,
who's he,
or you don't. And trying to find that is the art, but. Teams can do a lot without a franchise quarterback. I don't think the Falcons are in that place. So, I'm thinking middle of the pack, even in a division that is winnable, but they've got a tough road for the next year or two, I think.
Ever the optimist, ladies and gentlemen, Keith Whyte, and I will now
optimist is my
give
my
Keith. That's where the word pathological comes back in, and
that
you've
is when
used
it's
it very pertinently, if I may say so. So now your time to shine even more, Keith. 60 seconds or less, or a little bit more, if you want to deliver your key messages, ideally on responsible gambling.
I think it's working together, right? Even though we all have different motivations, there's all slightly different outcomes. The best way to progress is to have that open, honest dialogue. And, I will always engage in dialogue with folks that have something productive to say. It's just there's a lot of critics out there that are only focused on the negative. And we prefer to focus on the positive. Let's try and find solutions together. That's one of the reasons I think we are rightly positioned with 95% of Americans who believe that gambling should be legal, should be available, has problems, and so it needs to be regulated. And I think that's where the vast majority of the American public is. That's where we are. And I think together, we can work to better find that balance. So there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot more risk right now, but it's how we address that risk that is the art. And that's what keeps it fresh and vibrant, because we're learning so much, we're doing so much. There's a lot of progress that's been made, but there's a lot more that needs to be made. We're at a neat inflection point in the history of responsible gambling in America. And I think if we all make that conscious choice to keep driving forward, to not rest on our laurels, to keep moving, there's a lot of stuff we're going to do that may well catch America up to the rest of the first world countries that take responsible gambling seriously. And in the uniquely American context, I think we might get there with more public-private partnerships than being driven by regulators and politicians. So there's still that chance in the United States. There's a space in the United States for industry to really commit and to really dig in and really work. We don't see it with everybody, but we see it with the leaders in the space, and we can forge a voluntary harmonization of responsible gambling standards rather than waiting for regulators and legislators to clamp down, like we're watching happen in the UK and other jurisdictions. But I would say to our friends, that window is closing.
I've chosen to be generous, and I will not give Keith a time limit violation penalty because he's been absolutely amazing on this show. So thanks for coming, ladies and gentlemen. This is Keith Whyte, without any shadow of doubt, one of the worldwide recognized leaders of all responsible gambling efforts. My name is Martin Lycka. You've been watching, and thanks for that yet another episode of my Safe Bet Show. Keep doing that, and see you next time.
All right. Thanks so much, Martin.